For 3 weeks, my daughter's fiance sat in my back seat and called me old man. He never realized I was her father. He put his partner on speaker and said, after the wedding, she signs the property over. Her dad will be gone in 90 days. I kept driving. I started driving for a rideshare app about 8 months ago, a few mornings a week. I'm retired now, 30 years behind the wheel of a city bus before that. And when my wife passed 3 years back, the house started keeping a kind of silence I never got used to. Not the quiet of an empty room, the quiet of a room that used to have someone in it. The driving gives me somewhere to be, somewhere with a start time and an end time and other people's problems to think about instead of my own. The extra money doesn't hurt, but if I'm honest, I'd probably still be doing it if the app paid nothing at all. My late wife and I bought a small property outside the city almost 30 years ago. A cottage, really. One story, a porch that leaned a little on the north side until I finally shimmed it level in my 50s. 2 acres of land around it, mostly grass and one stubborn old maple she planted the summer we moved in. We didn't have much money in those days. I was driving buses and she was working as a home health aide, and the two of us together could barely scrape the down payment together, but we did it, and every weekend for years we drove out there and worked on it a little at a time. I built the fence around the property myself, one post at a time, over the course of 2 summers, because we couldn't afford to hire it done and I was stubborn about not wanting to. It isn't a grand piece of land. It was never meant to be an investment or a legacy in the way people mean that word now. It was where we went to be quiet together, and later where our daughter learned to ride a bike on the gravel drive, and later still where we scattered a portion of my wife's ashes under the maple tree because she asked us to, years before she got sick. My daughter is 34 now. She's a physical therapist, good at her work, the kind of person who remembers her patients' grandchildren's names. She moved into the city for her career about 6 years ago, and the two of us talk most Sundays, though I'll admit those calls got shorter and more careful after her mother died. Grief does that to people. It didn't used to be careful between us. When she was small, she rode beside me on Saturday mornings when I'd go check on a friend's garage, and by the time she was a teenager, she could diagnose a rough idle by ear better than half the mechanics I knew. We used to finish each other's sentences. Somewhere in the last 3 years, we started finishing them less. About 14 months ago, she told me she was seeing someone. She didn't say much about him at first, just that he worked in commercial real estate, that he traveled a lot for it, that things were still new. I didn't push. She's a grown woman and doesn't need her father running background checks on every man she has dinner with. But there was something in the way she talked about him early on, an eagerness to get past the subject rather than linger in it, that I noticed and set aside without examining too closely. Parents do that. We notice things and then decide not to have noticed them because the alternative is starting a fight we're not sure we want to have. 6 months in, she told me they were engaged. I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, genuinely happy for her, and also aware of a small, cold feeling underneath the happiness that I couldn't name and didn't like. I told myself it was nothing. Fathers get proprietary. It's a known failure mode of the position, and I've read enough to know I'm not immune to it. I still hadn't met him in person by the time all this started. There'd been a video call at a holiday gathering that lasted maybe 4 minutes before something on his end needed his attention, and a dinner that got rescheduled twice for what she called work emergencies. I didn't think much of it. People are busy. I told myself that a lot, actually, in those months. People are busy is a phrase that can cover a great deal of ground if you let it. 3 weeks ago, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the rideshare app put me on a fare downtown. A pickup outside a condo building I didn't recognize. A drop 12 minutes away at an office tower in the financial district. The man who got in the back seat was maybe 40. Expensive coat. Phone already in his hand before the door shut. He rated the ride 5 stars, which I only mentioned because the app must have started favoring the match after that. He showed up in my queue again the next morning, and the morning after that. By the end of the first week, it had become a routine so fixed I could have driven the route with my eyes closed. Same pickup, same 12 minutes, same drop at the same glass tower. He never once asked my name. There's a little placard clipped to the dash with it printed on there, required by the app for exactly this reason. And every morning he looked straight past it like it was part of the upholstery. I don't say that with any particular bitterness. I've spent 30 years being the person other people look past. Bus drivers get that too. You become furniture that happens to be steering. I'd made a kind of peace with it a long time ago. The peace you make with anything that stops surprising you. Old man, can you turn the AC down? He said that first Tuesday, not really phrasing it as a question. Old man. I remember noting it and letting it go. It wasn't unkind exactly, or it was unkind in the specific way that doesn't register as unkindness to the person saying it. The way a man doesn't notice he's stepped on your foot in a crowded elevator because from where he's standing there's no foot there at all. I didn't correct him. It was easier, 12 minutes at a time, to just be an old man behind a wheel than to explain who I actually was. I want to be honest about that decision because it matters later. I wasn't hiding anything in those first days. There was nothing yet to hide. I simply didn't see the use in making conversation with a man who'd already decided, before the door finished closing, that I wasn't the kind of person worth having a conversation with. I had no idea that first week that the office tower he was riding to every morning belonged to the same company where my daughter had once mentioned in passing that her fiance's business partner kept an office. office. I had no idea because I hadn't yet had a reason to put those two facts anywhere near each other. They were just two unremarkable things I happened to know, sitting quietly in different drawers of my memory, waiting for something to open both drawers at once. By the second week, the routine had a shape to it, and shapes are the kind of thing you start noticing the edges of. Every morning, he got in already on his phone, and most mornings, he stayed on it the whole 12 minutes, talking about numbers I didn't understand in a language I recognized anyway, because 30 years of driving people around a city teaches you the sound of business even when the specifics stay foreign. Square footage, cap rates. A word he used a lot, leverage, said the way some men say a woman's name, like it was a thing he was fond of. He complained about traffic that wasn't there. He complained about a barista who'd gotten his order wrong. He complained one morning about his fiance's father in a tone so casual I almost missed it entirely, the two of us 12 feet apart and him talking like I was a piece of the dashboard. Her old man still got some property out past the north end, he said to whoever was on the other end of the call. Some little place. Sentimental, apparently. My eyes stayed on the road. I want to say my heart didn't do anything at that, but that would be a lie. It did something. It just didn't do it where he could see. I told myself that first time that it was almost certainly a coincidence. There are a great many fathers in this city with a great many small sentimental properties, and a man in commercial real estate probably thinks about property the way I think about traffic patterns, which is to say constantly, reflexively, as a kind of background hum to every conversation he has. I filed it away and didn't call my daughter about it, because what would I have said? I heard your fiancé talking about some old man's land, and I have a bad feeling. That's not a sentence you say to your daughter 14 months into an engagement, not without more than a feeling. The thing that actually unsettled me that week wasn't him, it was her. I called on Sunday, same as always, and she sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I asked how the wedding planning was going, and she said fine, and then didn't offer anything else, which wasn't like her. My daughter has always been a talker when she's happy about something. When she was planning her college graduation trip, she called me twice a week for 2 months with details I didn't need and loved hearing anyway. This was different. This was fine. And then a long enough pause that I asked if everything was all right. Everything's fine, Dad, she said, and there was an edge on the word fine that hadn't been there a year ago. Why do you keep asking me that? I didn't have a good answer, so I let it go, the way I'd been letting a lot of things go for months by then. I asked if she wanted to come out to the cottage some weekend, just the two of us, and she said maybe, after the wedding things calmed down, and I said sure, no rush, and we hung up not long after that. I sat in my kitchen for a while afterward with the phone still in my hand, doing the thing you do when a conversation leaves a residue you can't quite name. Monday morning, he was back in the car, on the phone again before the door closed, and this time the conversation was about a deadline. Someone on the other end apparently needed something signed by a certain date, and he was reassuring them in the particular tone men use when they're reassuring themselves as much as anyone else. It's handled, he said. The timeline works if the wedding stays on schedule. After that, it's just paperwork. Paperwork. I've heard that word 1,000 times in 1,000 contexts, and it had never once put a chill through me before. I don't know how to explain the difference except to say that some words carry weight depending entirely on what they're standing next to, and that morning, sitting in the front seat of my own car listening to a stranger talk about paperwork like it was a foregone conclusion, the word landed on me like a stone dropped from a height. I said nothing. What would I have said? I drove him the 12 minutes, dropped him at the tower, and watched him disappear through the glass doors without a backward glance, same as every morning, and then I sat in the parking lane a moment longer than usual before pulling back into traffic. That was the week I started, without fully admitting to myself that I was doing it, paying closer attention. I didn't set out to investigate anybody. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to how the next several weeks unfolded. I wasn't a detective. I was a retired bus driver with a bad feeling and no evidence, and for most of that second week, paying attention meant nothing more sinister than not turning the radio on during his rides, so I could hear what he said instead of humming along to something else. He talked about a man named on the phone I never quite caught, someone he called by a first syllable that could have been half a dozen names, a business partner from the sound of it, someone he trusted with details he wouldn't have said in front of a stranger if he'd known there was one in the car with him. They talked about a company. They talked about financing. Only once that week, they talked about the father situation in a way that made my hands tighten on the wheel before I made myself relax them again. The father situation's not a problem, he said. He's 70-something and drives a car for a living now. Nobody's listening to that guy about anything. I kept my eyes on the road, 70-something. He wasn't far off. I was 71 that year and driving a car for a living now, in the sense he meant it, which was clearly not a compliment. I thought about correcting the math out loud just to see his face and didn't. There would be time for that later, I told myself, without knowing yet how true that would turn out to be. What I did do that Wednesday night was drive out to the cottage after my last ride of the day. I hadn't been in almost a month, and I walked the property in the last of the daylight the way I used to walk it with my wife, checking the fence line, checking the shed door, standing under the maple longer than I needed to. Nothing had changed, nothing was different, and somehow that made the feeling worse instead of better, because the ordinariness of it made the conversation I'd overheard that morning feel more like a threat and less like a misunderstanding. You don't plan to take something you don't think is worth taking. I drove home in the dark and didn't sleep well, and in the morning I got back in the car and picked up up my next fare, and it was him again. Same as always, already talking before the door shut. The thing that changed everything happened on an ordinary Thursday, and it happened almost by accident, the way the important things in a story like this usually do. He was giving directions to a version of himself, the way people do when they're distracted, muttering the turns under his breath while he typed something with his other hand. Left up here, then it's the second building past the light, the one with the blue awning. I wasn't going that way. I was taking him to his office, same as always. He was talking to someone else entirely, someone on the other end of a call I hadn't realized he'd already answered, walking them through directions to somewhere that had nothing to do with either of us, except it did. I recognized the description before I'd fully processed why I recognized it. Second building past the light, blue awning. That was 3 blocks from the apartment building where my daughter had moved when she started her job in the city. I knew it because I'd helped her move in 6 years ago, sweating through 2 flights of stairs with a couch that didn't want to cooperate, and I remembered the awning because she'd made a joke about it matching nothing else on the block. I told myself it was nothing. This is a large city. Thousands of people live within 3 blocks of my daughter's apartment, and a man in commercial real estate has professional reasons to be familiar with half the addresses downtown. I told myself that for almost the entire 12-minute drive, and by the time I dropped him at the tower, I'd nearly talked myself out of the cold feeling sitting in my chest. Nearly. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out the old accordion folder where my wife and I used to keep our property paperwork, the deed, the old survey. A folder gone soft and gray at the corners from decades in a filing cabinet. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I think I was looking for the feeling of my own name printed on a document, some reassurance that the facts of the place were still recorded somewhere the way I remembered them. I found the deed, my name and my late wife's name, side by side, the way they'd been for almost 30 years. I sat at the kitchen table and read it over twice, the way you reread a thing you already know by heart when you need it to still be true. I called an old colleague of mine the next day, a man I used to drive with at the transit authority who left 20 years ago to work in county records. Retired himself now, but still sharp. Still someone who knew how the machinery of property paperwork actually worked in a way I never had to learn. His name doesn't matter here. What matters is that he picked up on the second ring and listened to me explain badly that I had a bad feeling about something and didn't know how to check whether the feeling meant anything. You want to know if there's anything filed against your property, he said, cutting through my rambling with the patience of a man who's spent a career translating anxious citizens into actionable requests. Liens, applications, anything like that. I don't even know what I'm asking for, I admitted. You're asking for a title search, he said. It's public record. Anybody can request it. Doesn't take a lawyer. I can walk you through where to go, or I can just make a call myself, save you the trip. I told him I'd rather do it myself. I don't fully know why, except that it felt important suddenly to be the one who looked. He gave me the office, the hours, the specific desk to ask for, and told me not to worry too much until I had something to worry about. Good advice. I've never been very good at taking it. Friday morning, same ride, same routine. He was quieter than usual, working through something on his laptop instead of talking, and for once I was almost grateful for the silence, because my own head was loud enough to fill the car without his help. I dropped him at the tower and drove straight to the county building instead of picking up my next fare. The office was small, fluorescent lit, staffed by a woman in her 50s who looked like she'd spent a career being patient with people who didn't understand their own paperwork. I gave her the property address and my name, and watched her type it into a system that had clearly been updated sometime in the last decade, but not recently enough to feel modern. She asked me to wait. I waited. It's a particular kind of waiting, sitting in a government office on a plastic chair while a stranger looks up whether or not your life is about to change, and I don't recommend it to anyone. Nothing filed, she said when she came back. Deeds clean, no liens, no applications pending, nothing recorded against the parcel at all. You want a printed copy for your records? I said yes, mostly because I didn't know what else to say. She printed it, I paid a small fee, and walked back out to my car holding a single sheet of paper that told me in the plainest terms that nothing was wrong. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before I turned the key. I want to describe honestly what that relief felt like. It wasn't triumphant. It was the relief of a man who'd spent 2 weeks building a shape out of shadows and had just been handed proof the shape wasn't there, and some part of me simply didn't know what to do with its hands anymore. I remember thinking that I had let an old man's loneliness and too much time alone in a quiet house do something to my judgment I wasn't proud of. I drove home that Friday feeling for the first time in 2 weeks like I could put the whole thing down. I didn't call my daughter that night. I told myself I'd wait until I had something worth saying, and for the moment what I had was a clean title search and a story I'd nearly built out of nothing. I went to bed earlier than usual and slept clear through the night, the first uninterrupted sleep I'd had in nearly 2 weeks. It would be nice to tell you that feeling lasted. The feeling lasted exactly 6 days. Monday and Tuesday were quiet, the kind of mornings that make you wonder if you invented the whole thing out of loneliness and too much time alone in a quiet house. By Wednesday, I'd nearly stopped listening as closely. Wednesday evening, my old colleague from the county office called me back. You still thinking about that title search? He asked, without much preamble. He'd always been a man who got to the point. Clean, you told me. I saw the printout myself. Clean at the county recorder's office, he said. That's the public deed registry. It's not the only place a piece of property can show up on paper. There's a difference, he went on between what's filed and what's been submitted for filing. Sometimes there's a gap, especially if something's routed through a title company instead of straight to the county. If somebody was working on something involving your property and it hadn't reached the recording stage yet, my search wouldn't have shown it. Nobody's search would have. Why are you telling me this now? He was quiet for a second, the kind of quiet that meant he didn't love what he was about to say next. Because I ran into someone today. Small world, this business. Fellow I used to work with. He's over at one of the private title companies now, the kind that handle a lot of commercial and investment work. I mentioned your name in passing, nothing specific, just that I'd helped an old friend pull a search. He got a strange look on his face. What kind of look? The kind where a man remembers something he's not supposed to talk about and has to decide fast whether he's going to talk about it anyway. I let it pass. I let him get there on his own time. He didn't give me details, my colleague said. Wouldn't, and I didn't push, but he said your address sounded familiar, said it like it meant something to him, and then he changed the subject fast enough that I noticed. The relief I'd been carrying for 6 days went out like a light with a bad connection, all at once. I understood for the first time that a clean record and a safe piece of property were not the same thing. The paper had told me the truth. It had just been a smaller truth than I needed. I didn't sleep that night either. Thursday morning, he was back in the car, and I found myself genuinely afraid of what I might hear instead of simply braced for it. He was on the phone almost the entire ride, but the call was mundane, a lease renewal on an unrelated building. He said nothing next. He got out at the tower, same as always, and I drove away no wiser than I'd been an hour earlier, except in one respect. The absence of information wasn't the same as the absence of a threat. That afternoon, I called the private title company myself. The woman who answered told me, politely but firmly, that they couldn't discuss any client matter with someone who wasn't a party to the transaction, if there even was one. It was the correct, professional answer, and it told me nothing while protecting exactly the thing I was afraid of. I hung up and sat with the quiet of my kitchen for a long while. I thought about calling my daughter that night. I got as far as scrolling to her name, thumb hovering over the call button. Then I thought about what I'd actually say. Your fiancé might be doing something with my property, based on a strange look on a stranger's face relayed secondhand. I put the phone down. I decided instead that I needed someone whose job it was to know things I didn't. Someone who could pull a thread and follow it wherever it led, withstanding to ask questions that got answered instead of politely declined. Friday morning, before my first ride of the day, I called a lawyer. The attorney's office was on the 14th floor of a building I'd driven past 100 times without going inside. Her name had come from my late wife's estate lawyer, retired now, who told me she wouldn't waste my time telling me what I wanted to hear. She was maybe 45, silver already at her temples, the kind of person who listens with her whole body. I told her everything. Badly organized, the overheard calls and the address slip and the clean title search and the strange look on a stranger's face relayed through 2 other people. When I finished, she sat quietly, and I braced for her to tell me I didn't have anything actionable. You have more than you think, she said instead. Not enough to go to the police with, not yet, but enough to be worth investigating properly instead of piecing together secondhand. She explained what a title company does when it's brought into a private transaction. Someone wanting to use property as collateral or transfer an interest in it typically needs a title search done privately, and that could happen entirely outside the county's public system for weeks before anything got recorded. It explained exactly the gap my old colleague had described. The question, she said, is what document they'd need to make any of this real. You're the sole owner of record. Nothing moves without your signature, or without a document that claims to have it. I haven't signed anything. Are you certain? Not in the last year. Nothing that might have had language you didn't read closely? I thought about it, running back through the last 12 months. Something surfaced I'd nearly forgotten. Back in the spring, my daughter had asked me to sign a form, a liability waiver for a private event space her fiancé's company had some relationship with, hosting an engagement party that ultimately got moved elsewhere at the last minute. I'd signed it without much thought because my daughter asked me to, and it seemed harmless. I told the attorney about it. She wrote it down without comment, though I watched something shift in her expression. Do you still have a copy? I didn't. I'd signed it and handed it back and never thought about it again. She told me not to worry, that plenty of harmless forms get signed every year and stay exactly as harmless as they look, but she wanted the name of the venue and the company. I gave her what I had. I'm going to make some calls, she said. Title companies mostly. I have relationships with compliance officers who'll talk to me in ways they wouldn't talk to you. I also want to bring in someone who can look at financial structures if it comes to that. A forensic accountant. I know someone good. How much is all this going to cost me? She named a figure that made me flinch. Most of it only if we find something worth pursuing further. The initial inquiries, I'll do those on retainer. I agreed. What else was I going to do? She called me back 4 days later while I was between fares. I pulled into a parking lot to take the call because something in her voice told me I didn't want to be driving while I heard the rest of it. There's a company, she said, recently formed, 7 or 8 months old, registered under a name that doesn't obviously connect to your future son-in-law, but the registered agent traces back to an address associated with his business partner. That company submitted a preliminary inquiry to a private title company about 6 weeks ago, requesting a search on a parcel matching your property's legal description. An inquiry, not a filing. Not yet. An inquiry means they were doing due diligence, gathering information, probably building towards something more formal. It doesn't mean anything has been transferred. It means someone was preparing the ground. Preparing it for what? That's what I need the accountant for. Preliminary title inquiries happen ahead of financing applications, ahead of purchase agreements, ahead of a lot of legitimate business activity too. I don't want to tell you this is definitely what you're afraid of. I want to tell you it's worth taking seriously and worth moving quickly, because inquiries become filings, and filings become much harder to unwind. I sat in that parking lot a long time after we hung up, thinking about the liability waiver I'd signed in the spring without a second glance, wondering for the first time with real dread exactly what that piece of paper had actually said. The forensic accountant's name was on a card the attorney handed me, along with a folder thicker than I expected for 4 days of digging. Her office was cluttered in a way that suggested she trusted her own systems more than appearances. Your attorney asked me to trace the liability waiver, she said, sliding a printed page across the desk. Took some doing since the form itself wasn't filed anywhere public, but the venue company shares an address with a business services firm that handles paperwork for a handful of small companies, including the one that submitted that title inquiry. I looked at the page. It meant less to me than she clearly intended. A chain of company names and addresses that read like a foreign language. Walk me through it, I said, and something in her expression softened, the look of a person who appreciates being asked directly. The venue isn't really a venue the way you'd think of one. It's a small event space owned by a company that mostly handles administrative work for its owner's other ventures. One of those ventures is a company formed about 8 months ago. That's the same company that pulled the title inquiry. So the waiver I signed and the inquiry into my land come from the same people. The same small cluster of people, yes. I can't tell you what that waiver said word for word, but a document with your signature on it, dated last spring, exists somewhere in that cluster's files. A business doing due diligence around your property 6 months later would want a clean, verifiable signature sample on hand. It's the kind of pattern that shows up in cases involving elder property fraud. Someone gets a signature on something harmless looking months before they need it for something else. I sat with that for a long moment. Elder property fraud. Hearing the phrase applied to my own situation, out loud, clinically, made the whole thing feel more real and somehow more absurd at once. What do we do with this? I asked. We keep pulling the thread, the attorney said. I've requested the original waiver from the venue company directly, on the grounds you're entitled to a copy of anything you signed. That alone might spook them. I've also started requesting a full copy of whatever was submitted with the title inquiry. Private companies aren't as protected as they think once formal legal channels get involved. I drove home that evening thinking about the wedding, less than 2 weeks away. I thought about calling her and telling her everything, and talked myself out of it again. I didn't yet have proof, only a pattern, unsettling, but nothing that would survive being said out loud to a daughter who loved the man at the center of it. The waiver came back 9 days later, 4 days before the wedding, delivered by a courier faintly embarrassed by the gravity attached to a single sheet of paper. I was in the attorney's office when she opened it. She read it twice before saying anything, and when she looked up, her expression had the flatness of a person choosing words with real care. It's not what it was supposed to be, she said. Or rather, it is what it was supposed to be, on its face. A liability waiver, standard language, nothing unusual in the body of it, but look at the bottom. I looked. My signature sat at the bottom of the page, clean, unmistakably mine, exactly as I remembered signing it. Beneath it, in small print I hadn't read closely at the time, was a clause I had no memory of agreeing to. It authorized the venue company, and any affiliated entity, to retain the signatory's signature on file for use in future administrative and verification purposes related to events, transactions, or filings associated with the signatory or their immediate family. That's not a liability waiver clause, the attorney said quietly. That's a signature banking clause. It's the kind of language that shouldn't be buried in a form like this at all. It's the kind of language a court would have real questions about, if it ever came to that. But more immediately, it tells us exactly how they intended to get a verified, dated, legally obtained sample of your signature without ever having to ask you directly for one. I sat very still, looking at my own name at the bottom of a page I'd signed without reading closely enough. 6 months before this began, at an event my daughter had asked me to attend. He had this planned before they were even engaged that long, I said. It wasn't a question. I can't say for certain when the plan started, the attorney said, but I can say this document was drafted with a purpose in mind that has nothing to do with liability at an events venue. Someone wrote this clause on purpose, and someone chose on purpose to bury it in a form they knew you'd sign without reading every word. The wedding was 4 days away. 3 days before the wedding, I got in the car for what I didn't yet know would be the last time I drove him. I hadn't slept, not really, not since reading that clause 2 days earlier. The attorney had told me to keep driving him, at least until we had something more concrete. They'd do it around the wedding itself, she said, and the closer we got, the more likely he was to say something careless. Thursday morning, I picked him up at the usual curb. Same building, same time, same silence where my name should have been. He was different that morning, sharper, faster, the energy of a man running out of runway. He was on the phone before the door finished closing, and this time, there was no pretense of privacy. He put it on speaker outright, phone propped against his knee, and started talking like the car didn't exist. Tell me you fixed the language, he said. A voice came back, tinny through the speaker, unhurried in a way that suggested he'd done this kind of work before. It's fixed. The authorization's folded into the closing documents, dated appropriately. shortly. Matches the signature sample we already have on file. Nobody's going to flag it unless they're specifically looking. And if the old man's lawyer starts looking, there was a pause on the other end. You said there wasn't a lawyer. There wasn't, last I checked. My fiance mentioned her father's been asking a lot of questions lately. Probably nothing. He's 71 and drives strangers around for a living, not exactly running a fraud investigation out of his kitchen. I kept my eyes on the road, hands level on the wheel. 30 years of driving a bus, teaching them to do that no matter what was happening behind me. Once the wedding's done, he continued, she signs the transfer authorization as part of the estate consolidation paperwork. Routine, boring, exactly the kind of thing a new wife signs without reading closely because her husband's lawyer puts it in front of her along with 40 other pages. The property folds into the joint holding company within 30 days of the ceremony. Her father gets a notice eventually, but by then it's already done. He can contest it if he wants. Contesting a completed transfer with a verified signature on file costs more than the property's worth to most people his age. And if he does contest it, then it drags out in court for 2 years and he's dead before it resolves realistically, and the estate goes to her anyway, and we've lost nothing but time we were going to spend on this deal regardless. He said it so plainly that it took me a moment to absorb what he'd actually said. He wasn't threatening my life. He was describing my mortality as a favorable variable in a financial model. Her dad will be gone in 90 days, he added, almost as an afterthought, checking something on his laptop screen instead of looking up. 60 if the paperwork moves fast on their end. The other voice laughed, a short, easy sound. You make it sound simple. It is simple. It's just paperwork. People think fraud has to look dramatic. Most of the time, it looks like a man signing something he didn't read closely enough at exactly the moment in his life when he's too tired or too trusting or too in love with his own daughter's happiness to slow down and check. I want to describe, honestly, what it felt like to hear a stranger describe, in precise language, the exact mechanism by which he intended to take the last piece of my marriage and account for my death as a scheduling convenience. It felt like cold water rising around my ankles, then my knees, then my chest, while a man 20 feet behind me discussed my funeral timeline with someone I'd never see. What about her father's little side project, the other voice said. The old friend at County Records. The lawyer, she mentioned. Anything there worth worrying about? I checked, he said. County Recorder's clean. Confirmed 2 weeks ago. If he's got a lawyer poking around, they're poking around a title company that isn't going to volunteer anything without a subpoena, and by the time anyone gets that far, we're already past the closing date. Worst case, we renegotiate terms after the fact instead of before. Best case, nobody ever notices because nobody expects an old man in a used sedan to have a legal team. I nearly laughed. Legal team. I had one lawyer and one accountant, paid by the hour with money my late wife and I had scraped together over 3 decades, and that this constituted a threat at all was itself, to him, an insult. An old man punching above his weight class. We're still good for Saturday, the first voice said. It wasn't a question. Saturday's fine. Church is booked. Caterers confirmed. My future wife thinks this is the happiest week of her life. Nothing's changing. He laughed, short and satisfied. The laugh of a man who believes with total conviction that he has already won. He ended the call a few blocks from his building and didn't say another word for the rest of the ride. I pulled up to the tower, same as every morning, same 12 minutes, same glass doors waiting to swallow him whole. See you tomorrow, old man, he said, already half out of the car. I didn't answer. I sat with both hands on the wheel and watched him disappear through the glass, and then I called the attorney before I'd even pulled away from the curb. The attorney called 2 hours later, while I was parked in a fast food lot 3 blocks from my next fare, unable to drive anywhere until I heard what she had to say. I need you to understand what you're about to hear, she said, because I don't want it to sound smaller than it is just because I'm saying it calmly. Say it. The title company processed a closing document this morning, early, ahead of what we expected, which tells me they moved the timeline up once they realized someone was asking questions. It's a transfer authorization, structured to activate automatically 30 days after a triggering event they've defined internally as marriage. Your signature is on it, the same signature from the waiver. The notary who certified it has confirmed in writing that she never met you in person, never verified your identity, and was told the signing had already occurred remotely and simply needed her seal to complete the file. I sat very still in the driver's seat, engine off, the smell of fast food fries drifting in through a cracked window. A notary confirmed she notarized a document she never witnessed being signed, I said, needing to hear it out loud in my own voice before I could believe it belonged to my own life. Yes, that's not a gray area. That's not a due diligence question or a defensible business practice. That's notary fraud on top of the underlying forgery, on top of a document specifically structured to transfer your property using a signature harvested through a form you were never told would be used that way. I've already contacted the notary's licensing board, who confirmed they're opening a formal inquiry based on her statement. I've contacted the title company's compliance officer directly, who has frozen the file pending review, which means the transfer cannot record even if the wedding proceeds on schedule. And I've spoken with a detective in the financial crimes unit who wants a statement from you as soon as you're able to give one. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Somewhere behind the fast food counter, someone dropped a tray, and the small, ordinary clatter of it seemed to arrive from a great distance, from a version of the world where none of this was happening to me. He said I'd be dead within 90 days, I finally said. This morning, in the car, 60 if the paperwork moved fast. The line was quiet for a moment. I heard the recording, she said. The app retains audio for safety and dispute resolution, same as most of them now. I requested it the moment you called me from the tower this morning, and they released it within the hour once I explained the circumstances. It's clear. It's complete. It's exactly what you described. And worse, in ways I don't think you fully caught in the moment because you were driving and trying not to react. I thought back to the little notice clipped near the rearview mirror. The one about audio and video recording that every rider saw and no rider ever read. The one he'd looked straight through every single morning, along with the placard bearing my name. He had spent 3 weeks talking about my death and my daughter's future, and the mechanics of taking my land in a car with a running microphone, in front of a man he'd decided, from the very first ride, was too old and too invisible to matter. The wedding's Saturday, I said. I know. That's the part I need to talk to you about now, because you have a decision to make, and I want you to make it clearly, not out of panic. We have enough right now, today, to stop this cold. I can have the file formally flagged with law enforcement. I can have the transfer permanently blocked through the title company's compliance department, and none of it requires your daughter to know a single thing before Saturday, if that's what you want. Or we tell her today, before it happens, and she makes her own choice about what Saturday looks like. She has to know. I agree. I'm only saying it's your call, and it's a hard one, and I wanted you to hear both options stated plainly before you made it. I sat in that parking lot a long while after we hung up, my phone heavy in my hand, thinking about a fence I'd built one post at a time because we couldn't afford to hire it done, thinking about a maple tree planted the summer we moved in, thinking about a daughter who used to finish my sentences, and a version of myself that had let 3 years of careful grief turn into 3 years of careful distance between us, right up until a stranger in my back seat had, without ever once looking at me, handed me a reason to close that distance whether either of us was ready for it or not. I called my daughter. I didn't tell her everything, not on the phone, not in a way that would leave her alone with it while she was somewhere she couldn't sit down. I asked her to meet me, told her it was important, told her I loved her before I told her anything else, which I don't think I'd said plainly enough, often enough, in longer than either of us would probably admit. Friday morning came, the day before the wedding, and I had one more scheduled ride before any of what came next could happen. The app had already flagged the account for cancellation once law enforcement got involved, but the notification hadn't gone through yet by the time I pulled up to the usual curb, and there he was, same coat, same phone, already halfway to his ear, stepping toward the same back seat he'd occupied 30 times over the last 3 weeks, without once learning the name printed 6 inches from his knee. He got in still talking to someone else, some final wedding logistics call, cheerful in a way that made my hands tighten once on the wheel before I let them settle. I didn't say anything for the first several blocks. I let him finish his call, let him laugh at something the person on the other end said, let him exist for a few more minutes inside the version of Saturday he still believed was coming. When he hung up, I looked at him in the mirror for the first time in 3 weeks, like I actually meant it. Drive safe tomorrow, I said. Your father-in-law's a light sleeper. He went still. I watched it happen in the mirror, watched something behind his eyes scramble backward through every word he'd ever said in this car, trying to calculate exactly how much of it I'd heard and understood and kept. What did you say? His voice had lost the ease it carried 30 seconds earlier. I didn't answer. I held his eyes in the mirror until he looked away first, and somewhere in the silence that followed, his phone buzzed once against his leg, a notification he hadn't asked for and clearly wasn't ready to read.